With me is Sergei Shutov, who is one of our developers for TrackCare, based out of Sydney. And following this session, there will be another session. Our two sessions sort of go together in terms of the progression of steps in development and how to reach sort of the next level of development maturity. So where I end at the end of this session, Sergei will pick up at the 4 o'clock slot. So what are we going to talk about? So we're going to cover the progression of development best practices and how that progression works in terms of being able to get to development being more predictable, lower risk, hopefully less maintenance, et cetera. We're going to talk especially within the context of some of you that have been using our platform for a long time and may have very robust built-out shared development environments that you've been working on, and now you want to maybe either take it into source control or take that to the next level with automated testing and whatnot. So we'll talk specifically about the concept of a shared development environment versus a private development environment, and then also the concept of server-side source control hooks versus client-side source control hooks, and when is it appropriate to use which and in what scenarios. We're going to spend some time then talking about the gotchas of concurrent development on shared servers, and we will finish up with a demonstration of the Widgets direct sample application that's on GitHub and on the developer community, and how exactly that would work. Say if that was an application you've built out and you wanted to get it into source control, you wanted to start doing code promotion from dev into test, and you wanted to be able to work through actually doing, kicking off automated testing and whatnot. So perfect timing, so that you can see the pretty image up here. So basically, pursuing development best practices. So this development best practices lie in a continuum. There's different ways to look at it. There's different versions of this. This is one representation where if you are down at the very bottom here, you author code as a developer. That's the starting point, and the next step up is to control your code via source control like Git, VSS, Perforce, etc. Moving on to automated testing. Automated installation using, say, %installer, continuous integration with Jenkins, and then automated provisioning with Docker, which you've been hearing a lot about this week, I'm sure. So this presentation is going to cover these first 3 steps: author code, the IDEs, control code with the client-side versus server-side hooks, and then a little bit of automated testing with %unit test. Sergei's presentation will cover the next 3 steps in the progression. So you'll definitely want to stick around. So let's talk about the theory first. What is a shared development instance? Well, shared development instance is sort of the historical way of working for a lot of our customers in the InterSystems data platform space. So often the complexity of configuration and integrations, and especially data, make it really difficult to easily create private instances where developers can thoroughly test everything that they're doing. And so a very common solution is to have multiple developers sharing a namespace, because then you've got one investment in that namespace that's completely built out. The development can go on there. It is more likely to result in conflicts between different developers because only one person can be editing something at a time, and because basically the namespace becomes the arbiter or the control of who is touching or working on what. A private development instance is a little different. Each developer has their own namespace that they connect to that has the files, the classes, the routines, et cetera. It's a more modern way of working. When you think about most modern languages that you're actually compiling, you're working with your JavaScript source or your C++ source, and you're working in it locally. Then you run through a build process and send it out somewhere to be tested. So typically, developers with other languages are used to working in this sort of a scenario, but it absolutely requires source control in order to keep everything in sync. So just a quick poll of the audience. How many people are currently using some type of source control so that you've got discoverability and rollback and diffing and control over change? Okay, good. Maybe 2/3, maybe 3/4, sort of what I expected. That's good to see. So I want to help those of you that didn't raise their hand sort of move to that next level. Each developer gets to work in their own sandbox, and it allows multiple people to work on the same file at the same time, because you do merging at the time of check-in. So you get a lot more flexibility when you're able to leverage these private development instances because you've got source control keeping everything in check. Server-side source control hooks. So this is the historical way of working with source control on InterSystems database platforms. And that's because when Studio would connect to an instance, that the logic would run actually on the server for firing off the events for opening a document or saving a document or compiling a document. And those events within Studio that are running on the server, you could have callbacks for those that would trigger things like a checkout or a prompt of the user or a check-in. And everything there is based around the fact that in Cache and Ensemble and now Iris, your classes are actually stored as objects in the database. They're not natively a file on disk. And so your source control hooks would be responsible for translating the items in your namespace out to the file system. And that translation would take place, again, after a save or whatnot. So that these server-side hooks have been a very, very important part of our development practices for a long time. Now, some downsides of that is that there have always been some sort of example Studio hooks floating out there, but typically customers would roll their own. InterSystems doesn't provide a set of hooks for Perforce and for Git and for VSS and for Bitbucket and all of that stuff. We give you the toolbox to work with, and then you can build your own, or you can find something that someone else has built. So that means that customers in the past have been less comfortable with that because more of the responsibility lies on their shoulders for having good source control tools. Another aspect of this is that hooks are configured within the namespace, so nothing needs to be configured within the IDE itself. And starting in 2016.2, Atelier REST services added some limited support for working with the server-side source control hooks. There was actually a bug that was found last week where there's sort of a hole in the protection. So if you are looking at server-side source control hooks and you want to start playing with Atelier, it's really important that you are on 2017.2 or the next release of 2016.2 or 2017.1. So wait for that next maintenance release before you start kicking the tires really hard. And if you're already using server-side hooks with Atelier, then feel free to talk to me about some of the bad things that could happen so you totally understand the situation. Client-side source control hooks. This is the more modern, sort of accepted way, default way of working with source control. This is where on the developer's client itself, the files are sitting on the file system that they're directly edited, and then your IDE is what actually fires off the source control triggers as opposed to the cache server. And so you can just download Atelier and you just pull down eGit and you're off to the races. So there's actually hooks that are supported by a wide variety of vendors that say, I want to make it really easy for people to use Eclipse with Git or Eclipse with Perforce, or name your favorite flavor of modern source control system. And so those hooks are available for you. You don't have to write them yourself. You just pick them up and go. But it's, as opposed to the server-side hooks, client-side hooks, it's important to understand every developer has to configure their own local client-side hooks and manage their synchronization with a private development instance. Whereas with the server-side hooks, you set it up on the server, and then you can have a new developer join, and all they have to do is have a pointer to the server via Studio or via Atelier, and automatically they're put into the right workflow for your development practices. And again, it's your IDE, in this case Atelier, that keeps the files in your workspace up to date and in sync. So let's put it all together. On the vertical, we've got the private instance versus the shared instance, and on the horizontal server side, source control versus client-side source control. First of all, Studio always works in a server-side mode. There is no such thing as a client-side Studio hook. It's always firing events on the server, whereas Atelier is working in that, can work on server-side private, server-side client-side private, and also Atelier, if you wait for the next maintenance release, you can then use it on the shared server-side hooks scenario. That's what I'm going to be demonstrating today. I've got the patch in there so it works. What you definitely want to avoid is this sector here. If you've got a shared development instance, you don't want to use client-side hooks because it will end up being very frustrating for your developers. And I'll explain more about this here. So what are the issues with client-side hooks in the shared instance? So on this diagram, we see we've got two developers that are working. They've got client-side hooks, so they've got their own workspace locally with a copy of the files. And then the same files or classes, routines, whatever, are in the shared dev namespace. And the way Atelier works, you make changes locally, and then you push that file into the namespace for it to be compiled, for you to do your testing, and actually to follow through to see the results of your development. So let's say developer 1 edits B and pushes it out to the shared dev namespace. Developer 2 then edits D, and they push their change out to the namespace. Now 1 edits F and pushes it out to the namespace. And now let's say that, that number 2 over here also wants to edit F, goes to push it out to the namespace. Now they've got an issue, okay? Because the namespace isn't controlling concurrency. The developer has full control over that. So developer 2 can decide, they're informed, hey, you're out of sync with the server. What do you want to do? And they're like, well, I just wrote really good code. I want to test it, so they want to push it out. They don't necessarily know who is the last person to touch that or edit it. They don't know why it's different. All they know is it's different, and they know they've got a task to complete. And so they push it out. Now, when developer 1 goes to, maybe they're doing a long-running automated testing or maybe manual testing that could take a lot of setup and maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes to go through, in the middle of their test, suddenly the change that they made to F is gone. You're testing on an environment and your change just disappears because it's been replaced by somebody else's change. Maybe that can happen a few times with some grace, but I'm sure you can see that if you've got a very active development environment with a lot of developers, they're going to start pulling their hair out on this because one is trying to figure out, well, what's wrong with this namespace? Why aren't maybe something got out of sync, maybe I did something wrong, and so they push all of their changes into the namespace. So they've got a fresh test bed, right? And then 2 is in the middle of their testing at that point. They see stuff change its behavior. It's not working the way they expected. Well, maybe I did something wrong. Okay, so they push all of their changes out. And so they have a fresh test bed. And now you've sort of got king of the mountain type scenario fighting back and forth between 1 and 2. And it's just going to add, it's just going to create frustration. And it's not where we recommend you be in terms of a scenario. So the state of the shared dev instance is indeterminate, cannot be relied upon for testing changes by individual developers. So a developer can't rely that their change is going to stay there throughout the duration of their test with this scenario. Instead, server-side hooks with shared dev, let's look at that same scenario. So developer 1 changes it in B, and B now gets exported to the file system. So again, server-side hooks, cache, put stuff out to the file system. Developer 2 changes D, that gets pushed out to the file system. Developer 1 changes F, that gets pushed to the file system. Now developer 2 realizes they need to change F, but because we're using server-side source control hooks, the concurrency is managed by the hooks. So when they try to edit F, they're blocked, and they're said, you can't edit this, dev 1 owns it until they check it in or revert their change. So now developer 2 might get a little frustrated, but a lot less frustrated than having done work and push it out and have it disappear. Right? Because the last thing you want is your work to disappear when you're testing. And so instead, developer 2 can talk to developer 1 and say, hey, I need to edit F. When do you think you'll be done with it? 1 says, oh, I'm all set. So developer 1 goes ahead and checks in their change, which then frees it up in the shared development environment for developer 2 to grab, make their changes, push it to the workspace, and on they go. Okay? So there's a level of coordination that is required. That's why this isn't where this is not what we recommend you stay in, but this is the first place to start. And then, but as you can move along that development continuum to the point of getting automated installation, that means that now developers could actually start using their own private or private in combination with shared. So let's take a look at that hybrid model. Once you've got source control managing the concurrency on those items, now you're no longer locked into my namespace where all the developers connect to is the only place that people can work, because source control keeps everything in sync. Here, again, is the scenario. Oh, and I did want to highlight, we see developer 1's actually using Studio. Developer 2 is using Atelier. The nice thing about server-side hooks is it provides you with a more gradual on-ramp onto the use of Atelier. You've got some developers maybe that are a little more bleeding edge. They're willing to put up with some rough edges or areas that Atelier is still improving. They can jump on Atelier. Those comfortable with Studio can stay at Studio. But all the controls are managed on the server-side hooks, and so it allows you that on-ramp without having to do big bang. Okay, everybody go to Atelier and do client-side hooks. Does that make sense? But once you've got the source control in place that's actually managing synchronization with the workspace of what's going on, now you've got the option of actually having another developer, maybe even using client-side hooks, on their own private namespace and their own private workspace, and that stays synchronized with the server as well. So basically what you're able to do is have all of the different workspaces stay in sync because of the functions that source control provides you. Now you've got developer 4, maybe they're using server-side hooks because they still want to use Studio, or for whatever reason, maybe it's a large test bed, but you've just got one person working there. Again, source control keeps everything in sync. So you can have this nice hybrid approach once you've got source control in place, as long as you understand the rule about no client-side hooks with a shared instance. You know, if you've got client-side, keep it private. If you've got server-side, then you can use either private or shared. All right, so the importance of baselining. So we're talking about moving up that ladder for development maturity, and one of the important things is when you jump into source control, you need a good baseline of your code, the ability to take everything in your namespace and spit it all out to disk and put it into your branch so that you're able to diff and you're able to roll back. So there's several options for that. There's a cache UDL project that's out there on GitHub. In my demo, I'm going to use the baseline export feature in %studio source control.isc. You can make your own. It's basically walking the data dictionaries and figuring out what it is that's important to you and dumping it out. So with this move, you know, if everybody moves forward the way that we recommend and they get to the point of, okay, using Atelier, and then they get to the point of automating their build so that it's no longer a challenge for people to have their own private instances spun up when they need them. You know, maybe they moved to containers and now you can just spin up something in Docker whenever a developer needs it. What about server-side hooks at that point? Is there still a place for it? And the answer is absolutely yes. The InterSystems database platform is rather unique in that often we'll have, you know, the actual source that's running in test or running in live. You know, some customers just ship you know, the object code. Others actually have other source that's out there, and there's a real benefit that many customers experience in being able to actually connect to the test server and attach a debugger to it, or being able to, you know, put in a hot patch, or being able to put in some debug code. And if you are allowing developers to connect an IDE to a non-development environment, you must have server-side source control hooks in place. Okay? Without server-side source control hooks in place, you don't know who has touched what, you don't know what is changed from your source branch, and you know, the predictability and discoverability factors just drop through the floor. So even if you move to the mode of having client-side hooks and private instances, still having that ability to have your shared namespace locked by hooks where now a developer has to get permission, they can check something out, it gets unlocked, they're able to have traceability to who has made a change, you can do a diff against what's been checked out. So this is really, really important, you know, just to understand. And so you might decide you want some server-side hooks in addition to client-side hooks. And the InterSystems will continue to support server-side hooks, both because we'll have customers that will always be there for dev, but also we'll have customers that will continue to need them for test and live because of these scenarios. I do want to highlight down here that until you're on a version of the database platform that fully enforces server-side hooks for Atelier, you might want to consider disabling /API/Atelier to prevent people from just firing up Atelier, connecting to test, and, you know, pushing a change out outside of source control and outside of your change control processes. And then once you're on 2016.2.3 or 2017.1.2 or 2017.2.0 that have this change in it, or you can contact the WRC and get an ad hoc if you need it. At that point, it's fine to leave this open because the source control hooks will control the behavior and Atelier will abide by that. All right? All right, so let's go ahead and do a demo and sort of walk through a scenario here. So I'm going to be using the Widgets Direct application that's on the InterSystems GitHub site. I'm going to be using the baseline export tool that's in %studio.sourcecontrol.isc. This class is actually what we use internally for our development hooks, and they're Perforce hooks. So we use Perforce internally for Cache, Ensemble, Iris, TrackCare, HealthShare, et cetera. All of my internal applications, this is what we use. And it ships with Cache, so you can open this up in Cache lib and take a look, copy it, adjust it, you know, whatever. It's sample code. It's not something that you can call the WRC about. But it is a starting point if you're interested in working with Perforce. Okay, so I'm going to be doing this on Cache 2017 too. I'm going to be using Perforce. Actually, I pulled down the free Oracle VirtualBox VM that runs a Perforce server, and I'm connecting to that. That's something if you want to play with it, it's good for like 90 days. Or you can also use Perforce for free for 5 developers or less. So if you've got a small team and you just want to throw something in and start playing with that, Sergei will be showing Git as another flavor, another option. And then I'll be showing Studio and Atelier for this. How many of you have seen or heard about Widgets Direct? Show of hands. OK, a few of you. So there was a session yesterday. There's a couple other sessions today and tomorrow. Basically, it's a full-featured application that we've got up on GitHub that was written by Chris Stewart, who's one of our support advisors for TrackCare in the UK. And it demonstrates a full-stack Angular material with AngularJS, JSON, and REST. And then as part of these presentations this week, we're adding stuff like a %installer class, Docker manifest, unit test logic, scripts for continuous integration with Jenkins. My Perforce util scripts will be in there as well, all on GitHub. So you can grab any of this source that I show you today, or Sergei shows you, or Jeff will show later on, and you can just play with it. Okay, so hopefully that helps to speed up your development and speed up your education. So you can fork it from GitHub, and there's an article in the developer community about that. And after the conference, we're going to be taking a lot of our material from our presentations and putting them on the developer community for you as well. So the graphics and stuff that I was showing, those will be in an article. All right, so what are we going to build? Let's say we've got a mature application that somehow we've made it this far without using source control, but we have realized it's time to start using source control. All right, so we've got Widgets Direct fully configured and running on dev. And we want to take a good baseline of that and create a dev branch in source control, in Perforce. And then we're going to want to make a test branch out of that. And then we'll have a test environment where we can run our testing. And in this case, I'm going to imagine that my dev environment was a VM, so I could just clone it to make test. And so now I've got 2 exactly matched environments, which is what I want for a baseline, so that anything that moves between them is a diff. And I can know that behavior is based just on the change that moved and not on some other pre-existing change. So this is what I'll be building in the demo. So I'm going to configure source control on my dev namespace. I'm going to make a baseline and submit it into source control. I'm going to confirm that the concurrency controls work between Atelier and different users in Studio so that only one person can have something checked out at once. We'll submit stuff through Perforce, through source control, and I'll promote the change out of dev and into test. And then we're going to build the application and test out of source control and kick off some unit tests. All right? All right, so, and this slide is just there for your benefit later on. I'm going to actually do it on my laptop here. So, oh yeah, thank you. Okay, so here are my handy dandy notes for what I'm going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to jump into the application and confirm that Widgets Direct is working. And in this demo, anything that's running on port 57774 is my dev environment, and anything that's running on port 57779 is my test environment. So there's my Widgets Direct. I can drill down. I can see my widgets. I can edit my widgets. I'm not going to be demonstrating the app. You can see that later, or watch the video of Orion's presentation from yesterday. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my dev instance, and I'm going to set up source control. And I actually posted an article in the community a few days ago about how you can change the appearance of your cache cubes. So in this case, my dev is green, and my test is orange, because I don't want to really connect to test and make any changes directly there. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up a terminal in dev. And my Widgets Direct namespace, I'm going to run this build script. Now what this script does is it configures the namespace. It turns on source control hooks. It points to the Perforce source control hooks. It sets up the mappings between the way things are stored in the database and how I want things stored on disk. And then it sets up a little bit of configuration for Perforce in terms of a local workspace and whatnot. So you can, again, see all of this code on GitHub after the conference. So now everything is set up. And I'm going to connect with Studio and see that I've got source control available. All right, so I am on my Widgets Direct project here, or namespace rather, and this is on my dev, which I call latest. And what we see is there's a source control menu. And that source control menu is there because the source control has been turned on for the namespace. There's actually a page in the system management portal that lets you do that, lets you switch between different hooks. We can also see that there's basic information on the bottom about how I've been connected to the namespace. So the next step I'm going to do is that baseline export I talked about. I've got all of my code in my namespace. I want to get it into source control. So I'm going to take a look here. I've got my workspace I've said is going to live in C:my Perforce, and you can see in this subdirectory is completely empty. There's nothing in there. So this is not smoke and mirrors. This is actually going to populate it from running this baseline export. And it goes through all the classes in the namespace, all the routines in the namespace, finds every CSP application and grabs everything from that location and moves it into the source control setup. So I'm going to use that directory. I'm not mapping items. I'm not going to change files to read-only. I'm going to let source control do that afterwards, and I'm going to go ahead and start the export. And now we see I've got this widgets direct directory. I've got my dev branch, and we can see I've got classes, things from CSP app, and internal, which holds my unit tests that already existed in the namespace. And so it went ahead and it populated that. Now, one thing that's really important, I'm going to want to change my web application root as well. And the reason for that is, I had my web application set up just to point at C, my web application, but I actually want it to be pulling right from my source of truth in source control. So if I open up my web application definition here, you see my Widgets Direct web app was pulling from C Widgets web. I'm going to change that to point to my Widgets Direct subfolder inside of source control. So when I make changes via Atelier, if I make changes through Studio, I'll see them immediately when I pull up the web page, and I'm able to see that take effect. All right, so I went ahead and I saved that. And now I go ahead and refresh my page and confirm that my app still works. So now it's actually pulling the files from a different location. It's pulling them from my source branch on my local workspace rather than the place that I had it all set up before. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up P4V, which is the Perforce client. And I'm going to go ahead and connect to my Perforce server, which is, again, running in VirtualBox VM on my desktop. And this is a blank depot, so there's nothing in the branch. I've got this depot called depot, and that's basically a database of source. And you can see there's no little drop down there. It's completely empty. All right, so what I'm going to do instead, I need to populate that. So I'm going to go over to my workspace, which is all the files on disk, and we can see now there's actually something. There is something under depot. If I, let's see, show in workspace tree. Oh, I'm sorry. I did not actually connect to my workspace yet. I've got a workspace that's defined, shared _ widgets projects. So now that I connect to that, if I take a look in my workspace, I see, okay, depot now has this directory that got exported, my widgets direct, my dev branch, which has classes, CSP files, my JavaScript, my CSS, and my internal stuff. So it's on my workspace. I need to push it to my source control system. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this for add. And we see I've got a change list to be added with all of the files. I want my entire baseline. And I'm going to put a baseline check in here and submit it. So now if I go back over to my depot, I see there's no longer empty. This is the shared source control server. If other people have private instances, they'd be able to pull from this exact same place. You can sort of think of this as sort of the GitHub, if you're in the Git mindset of where everything gets pushed to. And I've got my entire baseline set up there. Now, we talked about the fact I've got a VM for base, for dev. I also have one for test. But I need to populate the branch. I got to get all the source from the baseline over. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click here. I'm going to integrate my changes. And I'm going to integrate it over into test to make a new branch, have it automatically resolve and submit. And you can see now there's my brand spanking new test branch that's got everything in it that dev has. So now I've got parity between my two branches. Everything is the same between my dev branch, my test branch, My environments are the same. I'm going to go ahead into my test environment where I already had set up Perforce, to be pointing to this test branch. And I'm going to sync everything into the workspace and build it all. So here's my orange cache cube for test. And I have this utility that, again, will be on GitHub that basically walks this entire folder structure that we see here. And it goes through and it imports everything and moves it to the right place and compiles it. So it's basically a build routine pulling from source. And then it kicks off any % unit tests that exist. So it just zipped through that, pulled everything up from disk, compiled it, and then ran a unit test. So if at the very end here, I see the results of my unit test, and there's a URL from %unit test, which is, the port is actually incorrect on it. That's just an unfortunate bug we need to take care of. But if I change it to the port, does anybody remember the port from my test environment? 5777? 9. It's 9. I log in. I can see my unit tests all pass. There's just some basic widget unit tests there that check to see that the JSON came out properly. And everything passed. So that's great. I'm also going to confirm that my application works properly. So this is the URL with the 9 in it for my test environment. And hey, everything is there. It says, welcome to Widgets Direct Chris, so that's everything that came from the depot. Now, I notice it says, welcome to Widgets Direct Chris. That's because Chris Stewart, who wrote this, actually hard-coded his name in the welcome bar. And he actually did this. You can go see it on GitHub. I think he's going to make it dynamic later on. I don't have time to do that, but I'm a developer, and I'm working on this now, so I want it to reflect me a little more than some guy in the UK. So I'm going to fire up Atelier here, and I'm going to make a change via source control, and I'm going to promote it via the source control from dev into test and make sure everything works. And then we'll also make sure that, the source control hooks do what they're supposed to when it comes to Atelier and Studio, and that other people aren't able to grab my changes or overwrite my changes or anything like that. So here's Atelier fired up. I already had defined a server definition for latest, which is where I've got all my development going on, and it's got the widget direct namespace there. So I've got a project here that's Widgets Direct, and inside I've got my Widgets Direct web application, and under modules, under page, there's my page controller. Now I just happen to know that this is where the REST call happens with Chris's name in it. And so I want to change that to reflect my hard work on this application. Gosh darn it. So one thing to notice at the very top of Atelier here, we've got this source control menu. All right? This is defined on the server. This is a result of the server-side hook. So Atelier is calling into the server, and in the namespace it's saying, hey, do you have any hooks set up? Do you have any source control hooks? And the REST services on the server are returning the menu and everything that it contains. And so this is the same set of menu items that we had seen as we did when I opened up Studio and showed that there's source control menu. So this is a little different than if you're used to doing client-side source control with Eclipse. Usually there's a Teams folder or a Teams menu item that you're able to do things from. With this, because server-side Studio extensions can be used for so much more than just source control. It can be used for code completion. It can be used for compiler warnings. It can be used for doing all sorts of logic, beautifying your code, adding additional properties that all of your classes should add, stuff like that. So we decided to not put it under Teams because that would be a little misleading. And so instead, it just shows up however you define the menu items, it'll show up in the top menu of Atelier just like it does in Studio. Questions at the end? Is that good? So we'll go ahead. I've got the option to check this out. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. And now it is checked out to me. If I looked under source control, I can see I've got undo checkout and check in. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to Ben. Now, in the meantime, Sergei, who's been checking out the development that I've done, realized that, oh, wait a minute, that says Chris's name. And I'm going to work on that app, and I want to make it mine. So we're going to switch over to him and take a look at.
Well, first of all, as you can all see, I have a Mac, not a Windows computer as Ben. And if you look closely, I actually run Atelier on my Mac instead of using the virtual machine as I would do with the Studio. And I connected to the Ben shared development environment with the Ben server. I actually have my username here, and when I connect, you can see that Perforce source control hook actually realized that it's me, and I'm working with my Perforce user there.
But an important thing to point out is the fact that it's really hard to see in the back bit if you watch in the video later. It actually lists our workspace on the bottom. And so this is not Sergei's workspace versus my workspace. There is a shared _widgets project workspace that everybody that's connecting to the server is using. So you can think back to that visual that I had said where everything translates down to the file system of the server.
And I still have the same source control menu that Ben has. So now I want to go and try to change something here. And it will tell me here in the red, again, I unfortunately cannot make this bigger for some reason, but it will tell me that Ben is already editing this file, so my changes won't be propagated to the server. I still can edit it in my local environment because, well, I have a copy on my local computer, but it won't be propagated and won't change Ben's work on the server.
So if you try to save your changes back to the server, he's told that things are out of sync between his local workspace and the copy on the server. So he's going to try to blow away my changes and say, save the local copy and push it out to the server. And it says on the very bottom that it was saved locally but couldn't be saved remotely because it's being edited by user Spead. So that message there is actually from the hooks. It's from the source control hooks. And the hooks manage who can and cannot edit things, and it returns the error when somebody can't edit it. So he's stuck with his local changes here, and my changes are safe on the server. Again, this requires a very recent patch. So if you have a question about that, feel free to grab us afterwards, or just make sure to get the next maintenance release before you really kick the tires on this. So just again to show that I wasn't lying about the mixed development environment, if I fire up Studio, you can see here I'm logged into latest as _system. So this is a third cache user completely connecting to the same shared workspace. And when I'm taking a look at pagecontroller.js, I see on the bottom here that it's currently checked out to user Speed. Okay, so _system can't edit it, Sergei can't edit it, Speed has full control over it. And the difference with Studio is if I try to edit it, the whole file is read-only, and it doesn't allow me to do anything. So we're going to try to add that same behavior as an optional configuration in Atelier. It's not available now, but it is, the server will protect things from being pushed out. So I'm going to go back now to Atelier, and I'm going to go ahead and submit my change. I'm going to check it in. And there is a conflict resolution because it's saying, wait a second, you've got this local Ben copy, and on the server it says Chris. Well, that's what I want. I want to use what I edited, so I'm going to push that out. So I'm going to save my local copy, push that to the server, log in with my Perforce credentials here. And this behavior here, this pop-up's all part of the hooks. So I can do a check-in, right from Studio. And I can select the files that I want to check in. I'm going to change the banner to reflect best developer. And I'm going to submit it. So now I've pushed again from my local Atelier onto the shared server. And so if I go and I take another look at the app on the shared server and open it up, sorry, it's the wrong one. It says Chris. Why does it say Chris? Anyone have any ideas? What did I edit? What kind of file? It's a JavaScript, so it was cached. So I just do a hard refresh on the page. Now it says Ben. Okay, so it pulls it down to my browser. I'm happy, and I'm like, great, this looks great. Let's push it on to test. Now, there are many ways to do this. I'm going to do sort of the brute strength approach. You can do this on a per change basis. Internally, that's how we do it. We basically collect all the changes for a given change set and move those individually from branch to branch. There's a lot of different ways. For the sake of the demonstration, I'm just going to move everything from the dev branch into the test branch, just to show how that moves forward. I'm happy to discuss strategies for promotion of code from dev to test and live. Later on, feel free to grab me. So now I've just moved something. I've moved it forward into test. So let's go ahead and take a look at my test application. And in this case, it's JavaScript, so it doesn't have to be compiled. Once the workspace is updated, we're good to go. And we can see in my application, it's Ben. Now, technically, I would be going into my test, and I would do this build and test, which is it's gonna sync it, it's gonna build it, all of this. That's really what I do every time, because I'm in the same environment. I could wave my hands and make that a little faster. But anyway, I'd run my build script on test. It runs the test. It runs the build, it runs the test, and now we're good to go. So that just walked through, and also the unit tests ran. The unit tests were successful. So that basically walks through that whole process that I promised we'd take a look at. And let's go back to the slides here. And again, to refresh what we did, or to review what we did dev, we did the baseline on dev, we configured source control on dev, we pushed it into a dev branch, and then we made our test branch, and then we pushed everything into the test environment, and then we built it, and we just did a discrete change in dev, pass it into source control, from branch to branch into the environment, validated it, it was all good to go. Wrapping things up, so there's a bunch of other widget direct sessions. If there are sessions like Orion's, the first one, Angular, JSON, and REST OMI. If you didn't catch that, I'd encourage you to catch the recording afterwards or look at Chris Stewart's widgets direct tutorials on the developer community. They're great. He's got 13 articles on there. It's a Lego bricks approach, step by step by step. This is how you build an app. Directly after this is Sergei's session, where he's going to take what I've done and take it further with %installer and Jenkins integration and the unit testing, and then Docker build. And then Jeff in the back is going to be doing, after that, a session on Docker and taking the same app and doing some more stuff with Docker containers. Next step, please complete the survey in the app. The session recording and slides are going to be available at learning.intersystems.com after the summit. Visit the Tech Exchange, to learn more, or grab one of us afterwards. And then stay here for Sergei's session. So let's open it up for questions. And please speak into the mic so that we can get it for the sake of the recording. I know there was a question up here. Okay.
Do you provide, apart from Perforce, do you provide any other server-side hooks, samples, or code to start with, like for Git or something like that?
So there are quite, the question, everybody can hear because of the mic. So the question is, are there more sample hooks? And the answer is yes. There's a lot out there, especially in the developer community. So there's a set of Git hooks. There's actually sets of Git hooks on the developer community, plus other ones that people are working with. So my suggestion, if you're looking for sample code, go on there and ask, or do a search and then ask if you don't find what you're looking for. And it's something that, with the advent of the developer community now, we've got a better starting point. Before you had to ask your sales engineer, and they asked internally, and we tried to find you something that way. At least now you guys can go peer-to-peer. Did you have a question, or got it answered? Other questions? Yeah, front row here. Front row.
So, Ben, you mentioned before the ability to launch the web pages just from the server-side session hooks.
Yep.
That example, is that in a particular release?
The example of launching that web page? Or?
Yeah, the example of the hooks that you've used to launch that web page.
So that was all completely server-side. So it's the same. If you take a look at any version of Cache that has %studio.sourcecontrol.isc, that goes back to like Cache 5. It's the same. We didn't do anything for Atelier. Atelier just supports that behavior. But I did get a chance to research your question yesterday, and it doesn't currently pass along the context of the current file to that web page. So that's something I'm going to look into with the Atelier developers to try to get that fixed, because I'd like it, and I'm. Well, so in my case, I actually had a list of all the files that were checked out to me in my default change list. And there were checkboxes next to them. And so I just selected, this is the one I want to check in. If I had done the same thing in Studio, the behavior of that page auto-selects the one that I was at when I navigated to it. So I'd like to get that behavior back. Okay? Another question? Oh, okay. All right, so feel free to grab us afterwards. Thank you guys for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference.